The war did not end all at once. It ended in fragments, on radio broadcasts that crackled through kitchen speakers, in folded newspapers damp with morning dew, in factory whistles that blew not for urgency, but for closure. For years, the nation had lived on a rhythm set by distant artillery and the steady churn of assembly lines. Now the tempo softened. Victory was announced in headlines, but peace arrived more quietly. In the late summer of 1945, the streets of cities like New York City and Chicago filled with relief. There were parades, kisses in crowded squares, confetti falling like improvised snow. Yet even in those moments of celebration, something uncertain lingered. For millions of Americans, the war had not simply been a conflict overseas, it had been a way of life. It had dictated work hours, ration books, gasoline coupons, scrap drives, and the steady ache of waiting for letters from faraway continents. At train stations across the country, the change felt most tangible. Platforms that had once sent young men away now received them back. Steam curled around polished shoes and duffel bags. Mothers scanned faces with anxious intensity. Children, older than when their fathers had left, hesitated before embracing what felt both familiar and foreign. The soldiers returned not to fanfare alone, but to questions. Who were they now, and what was the nation they were returning to? The army industries that had powered victory began to slow. In cities like Detroit, factories that had produced bombers and tanks reduced their shifts. Assembly lines that once ran day and night fell silent for hours at a time. Workers who had taken pride in contributing to the arsenal of democracy now wondered what peacetime would demand of them. The clang of metals softened into uncertainty. Women who had stepped into industrial roles during the war, symbolized by figures like Rosie the Riveter, faced a complicated transition. They had proven their skill and endurance, mastering machinery and managing production quotas. Now, as men returned home, many were expected to relinquish their positions. Some did so willingly, eager for domestic stability after years of strain. Others felt the quiet sting of displacement. The factories no longer needed as many hands, and society seemed unsure what to do with the independence women had discovered. In small towns, the shift was subtler. The war bond posters faded in storefront windows. Ration books became souvenirs tucked into drawers. Churches held services of thanksgiving rather than prayer vigils. The mood was not exuberant, but exhaled, like a body finally allowed to rest after holding tension for too long. The federal government, which had expanded dramatically during wartime, now faced the task of guiding the country back toward civilian life. One of the most transformative measures was the Servicemen's Readjustment Act of 1944, commonly known as the GI Bill. Its promises, education, low-interest home loans, and unemployment benefits offered returning veterans more than gratitude. It offered possibility. Across the country, former soldiers enrolled in colleges in unprecedented numbers. Campuses that had once seemed elite or inaccessible became crowded with men older than traditional students, men who carried both textbooks and memories of foxholes. Universities expanded dormitories and lecture halls to accommodate them. Education, once a privilege for many, began to feel like a national investment. Housing, too, underwent transformation. The demand for homes surged as young families formed quickly. Developers responded with entire neighborhoods constructed almost overnight. In the outskirts of cities, rows of modest houses appeared, each with a small lawn and a driveway. In places like Levittown, suburban life became not merely an option, but a vision of the future. The suburbs promised order after chaos. Streets curved gently rather than twisting unpredictably. Lawns were trimmed, fences painted white. The design seemed to suggest that life could now be planned, predictable, contained. Veterans used GI Bill loans to purchase homes they might never have afforded before. For many, ownership symbolized more than shelter. It symbolized permanence. Inside these new houses, the rituals of peacetime took shape. Breakfast tables replaced mess halls. Evenings were spent around radios, and soon televisions, rather than beneath foreign skies. Children played in backyards instead of reading war headlines. Domestic life felt fragile at first, as though it might shatter under the weight of unspoken memories, but gradually, repetition bred comfort. Factories retooled themselves for civilian production. The same industrial might that had produced tanks now produced automobiles, refrigerators, and washing machines. In Pittsburgh, steel, once destined for warships, became girders for bridges and beams for skyscrapers. The nation redirected its energy inward, building infrastructure instead of armaments. Automobiles became symbols of mobility and optimism. Families saved to purchase new models, gleaming with chrome and possibility. Highways expanded, connecting suburbs to cities, cities to states. The act of driving, of choosing direction, felt emblematic of freedom regained. Yet beneath this prosperity lay uneven realities. Not every veteran benefited equally from the GI Bill. In parts of the South, segregation limited access to education and housing for black servicemen. Redlining practices restricted where families could buy homes. The promise of suburban tranquility was not universally shared. For many African American families, the transition to peace meant confronting barriers that had not disappeared with victory overseas. In rural areas, the war's end brought agricultural shifts. Mechanization increased, reducing the need for manual labor. Some farm families moved to urban centers in search of stable employment. The countryside grew quieter in places, even as cities expanded outward. The emotional adjustment proved as significant as the economic one. Men who had endured combat sometimes found it difficult to explain their experiences. Nightmares intruded on otherwise peaceful evenings. The term post-traumatic stress disorder did not yet exist in common language, but its symptoms lingered in silence. Families learned to navigate moods they did not fully understand. Communities, too, recalibrated. During the war, collective purpose had unified neighborhoods. Scrap drives, rationing, shared anxieties, these had bound people together. In peacetime, individuality reasserted itself. Competition replaced cooperation in subtle ways. The shared mission dissolved into personal ambition. At train depots in towns like Kansas City, arrivals continued for months. Each homecoming felt both triumphant and ordinary. Life resumed in increments. A man returning to his father's hardware store, another apprenticing at a local barrage, a third attending night school under the GI Bill's provisions. History did not pause, it pivoted. The federal government encouraged consumer spending to avoid the economic collapse many had feared after wartime production ceased. Instead of plunging into depression, the economy surged. Pent-up demand for goods created booming markets. Refrigerators, radios, and automobiles became attainable aspirations. Labor unions, strengthened during the war, negotiated wages and benefits in a peacetime economy. Strikes occurred reflecting tensions between corporate interests and workers' expectations. The transition from emergency mobilization to normal industry required negotiation, compromise, and sometimes confrontation. Politically, the nation entered a period of recalibration. President Harry T. Truman inherited the presidency in 1945 after Franklin Roosevelt's death. Truman faced the delicate task of guiding a victorious yet uncertain country into peace. His administration grappled with reconversion, labor disputes, and the emerging tensions that would soon define the Cold War. But in those immediate post-war years, the mood remained suspended between relief and anticipation. Newspapers reported on international conferences and atomic diplomacy, yet the average American focused on simpler milestones: a first paycheck, a newborn child, a newly planted garden. In cities, streetcars clattered along tracks once crowded with uniformed passengers. Now they carried office workers and shoppers. Department stores displayed consumer goods instead of ration signs. The shift was visible not in dramatic headlines, but in window displays and weekly pay envelopes. In kitchens, women experimented with recipes that no longer required substitution. Sugar and butter returned to shelves. Coffee tasted stronger. The restoration of abundance felt luxurious, even mundane. The baby boom began almost imperceptibly.
Couples who had postponed marriage or children during the war now embraced domestic life with urgency. Hospitals expanded maternity wards, schools prepared for future enrollment surges. The soundscape of neighborhoods shifted to include strollers creaking along sidewalks. Meanwhile, veterans gathered in local halls to share stories. The American Legion and Veterans of Foreign Wars meetings provided spaces where memories could be voiced among those who understood. These gatherings bridged the gap between battlefield and backyard. The nation's infrastructure, strengthened by wartime necessity, now supported peacetime growth. Shipyards converted to commercial production. Airfields transitioned from military to civilian use. The skills acquired during war, engineering, logistics, and medicine, fed into civilian innovation. Yet the shadow of atomic weapons lingered.
In the years after the war, the noise of factories softened into something steadier, more domestic. The urgency that had once driven production lines and troop trains gave way to the quiet persistence of construction crews laying foundations in open fields. Across the edges of American cities, farmland and scrubland were measured, leveled, and divided into neat rectangles. Wooden frames rose where corn had once grown. Streets were drawn in gentle curves instead of rigid grids, as if even the map makers wanted to signal a softer future. The dream was simple, and because it was simple, it felt powerful, a house of one's own. For returning veterans, the promise of stability was not abstract, it was built into policy. The GI Bill had opened doors that once seemed permanently closed. Low-interest mortgages, tuition assistance, and unemployment support created a bridge between wartime sacrifice and peacetime opportunity. Banks that had once been cautious began approving loans for modest houses on the outskirts of cities. A generation that had slept in barracks and foxholes now signed paperwork for two-bedroom homes with small lawns. In places like Levittown, entire neighborhoods appeared almost overnight. Developers used assembly line techniques refined during the war to build houses quickly and affordably. Each structure looked much like the next: white siding, green shutters, a narrow driveway, but uniformity was not seen as dull, it was reassuring. Consistency suggested predictability, and predictability suggested safety. On moving days, the streets filled with borrowed pickup trucks and borrowed optimism. Mattresses were hoisted through front doors. Kitchen tables were positioned beneath windows that overlooked empty yards waiting for grass seed. Children explored closets as though they were hidden rooms in castles. The houses smelled of fresh paint and cut lumber. They did not yet carry the scent of dinners cooked or arguments whispered, but they would. The suburbs were not only about houses, they were about distance. Distance from crowded city blocks, from industrial smoke, from memories of ration lines and casualty lists. Highways extended outward like veins, connecting downtown offices to quiet cul-de-sacs. The Federal Aid Highway Act of 1956 would later formalize this expansion, but even before them, roads were being widened, paved, and straightened. The automobile became essential. Ownership meant autonomy, a commute to work, a weekend trip, a drive-in movie under open skies. Each morning, men in pressed shirts backed their cars out of driveways in near unison. Engines turned over, garage doors lifted, and the day began with the same choreography repeated house after house. The commute into cities like Chicago or Los Angeles became routine. Trains still ran, but increasingly, highways defined the rhythm of employment. Back at home, the daytime suburbs felt almost suspended in quiet. Women, many of whom had worked in wartime factories, now navigated a different landscape of expectation. The image of domestic fulfillment was promoted in magazines and advertisements. Shiny appliances promised efficiency and modernity. Washing machines hummed in laundry rooms. Vacuum cleaners traced neat lines across new carpeting. The television flickered at night in living rooms arranged around its glow. Programs sponsored by detergent brands and cereal companies offered wholesome laughter and gentle moral lessons. Families gathered not only to be entertained, but to witness a shared national culture emerging through a screen. In developments outside Philadelphia and Cleveland, the blue light of television sets pulsed in near synchronization after sunset, visible through thin curtains. Children adapted quickly to suburban geography. Sidewalks became racetracks for bicycles with playing cards clipped to spokes. Lawns served as baseball fields until dinner was called. The absence of heavy traffic made parents feel secure enough to let their children roam within sight of the porch. The soundscape of these neighborhoods included bouncing rubber balls, laughter, and the occasional bark of a dog tied to a new fence. Stability was built into repetition. Saturday mornings meant mowing the lawn. The scent of cut grass drifted from yard to yard as fathers guided push mowers in straight, deliberate lines. Garden hoses snaked across driveways. Neighbors exchanged nods over hedges, sometimes conversation, sometimes silence. Community formed slowly, through proximity rather than grand declarations. Yet the promise of the suburbs was not equally distributed. Many developments enforced restrictive covenants that barred black families and other minorities from purchasing homes. Redlining practices by banks and insurers reinforced segregation. While white veterans accessed the full benefits of the GI Bill, black veterans often encountered systemic obstacles. Stability, for some, was conditional. Even so, the suburban ideal grew. Shopping centers replaced corner stores. Instead of walking downtown, families drove to plazas with wide parking lots and fluorescent lighting. Grocery carts filled with processed foods symbolized abundance. The shift from local to centralized commerce reflected broader economic trends. Consumerism became intertwined with identity. In kitchens, new products changed routines. Frozen dinners simplified meal preparation. Packaged bread replaced daily bakery visits. Time-saving devices allowed for schedules structured around children's school events and social clubs. The rhythms of suburban life revolved around calendars pinned to refrigerators. Education expanded alongside housing. Elementary schools were built quickly to accommodate the baby boom generation. Yellow buses carried children through winding streets each morning. PTA meetings gathered parents eager to shape curricula and extracurricular programs. Education was seen both as civic duty and personal investment. Churches followed rooftops. Congregations established new sanctuaries in converted garages before constructing permanent buildings. Sunday mornings filled streets with families dressed in coordinated outfits. Faith communities offered continuity, reinforcing moral frameworks that aligned with the era's emphasis on order. Even leisure was organized. Backyard barbecues replaced urban dance halls. Lawn chairs circled charcoal grills. Neighbors brought casseroles and lemonade, discussing mortgage rates and Little League standings. The extraordinary sacrifices of war receded into anecdotes shared occasionally, but the focus shifted to the present. In cities like Detroit, the automobile industry thrived, feeding suburban growth. Car ownership was both cause and effect of expansion. New models debuted each year with subtle tail fin variations, chrome accents, and pastel colors. Dealerships reported steady sales to families eager to signal upward mobility. The emotional texture of suburban life was complex. On the surface, it exuded calm. Beneath it, anxieties lingered about employment stability, about global tensions that simmered into the Cold War, about maintaining appearances. The lawn had to be trimmed not only for aesthetics, but for conformity. Curtains were selected carefully. Deviations from the norm stood out sharply against uniform facades. For many women, isolation crept in quietly. Days structured around housework and childcare left limited adult interaction. Some found fulfillment in community groups and volunteer work. Others felt confined by expectations that contrasted sharply with wartime independence. The promise of stability sometimes masked personal restlessness. Teenagers, raised in comfort unknown to their parents, began to shape a distinct culture. Rock and roll drifted through bedroom radios. Drive-in theaters became gathering spaces. Suburban garages housed amateur bands experimenting with amplified sound. The very stability that parents sought created space for youthful rebellion. Meanwhile, urban centers changed. As middle-class families relocated outward, cities experienced demographic shifts. Economic resources followed rooftops. The tax base transformed. The distance between city and suburb became not only physical, but socio-economic. Highways facilitated these separations. Overpasses cut through established neighborhoods, often displacing minority communities. The convenience of suburban commuting carried hidden costs. Yet at the time, the narrative focused on progress. Roads symbolized connectivity and modernity. In the evenings, after children were tucked into bed, couples sometimes sat on front steps listening to crickets. Conversations drifted toward hopes for their children, college degrees, secure careers, perhaps larger houses. The memory of war reinforced gratitude for ordinary nights unmarred by sirens. The Cold War introduced subtle tension into this domestic tranquility.
The war had ended, but the fear had not. It simply changed its shape. In the late 1940s and into the 1950s, the American home, newly built, freshly painted, filled with modern appliances and the steady glow of television, became something more than a refuge. It became a listening post, a front line without trenches, a quiet arena where global tensions slipped through radio waves and settled gently onto kitchen tables. In suburbs outside Washington, D.C., fathers unfolded evening newspapers with headlines about Soviet expansion in Eastern Europe. In apartments in New York City, mothers adjusted the volume on radios broadcasting speeches about atomic power and ideological struggle. The world, once separated by oceans, now felt uncomfortably close. The term Cold War suggested distance, something frozen, far away, but its presence was intimate. It entered homes through the calm, measured voice of President Harry S. Truman, who spoke of containment and responsibility. It echoed later in the reassuring tones of Dwight D. Eisenhower, who warned of a growing military-industrial complex, even as he maintained a posture of steady resolve. The living room became a classroom in geopolitics. Families gathered in the evenings not only for entertainment, but for updates on distant crises, Berlin, Korea, Cuba. The television set, once a novelty, became a national hearth. Anchormen spoke with solemn authority. Maps appeared behind them, arrows drawn across continents to explain movements of troops and missiles. Children absorbed fragments of these broadcasts without fully understanding them. They heard words like communism, containment, and nuclear deterrence before they could spell them. The language of global power seeped into their vocabulary alongside multiplication tables and spelling lists. At school, the anxiety took a more physical form. In classrooms across California and Ohio, teachers interrupted lessons for drills. At the sound of a bell or announcement, children slid beneath wooden desks, tucking their heads and covering their necks. Duck and cover, they were instructed. The exercise was orderly, almost mundane. Chairs scraped against linoleum floors, knees bent, silence followed. The students did not fully grasp the scale of what they were rehearsing for, a nuclear explosion bright enough to turn midday into blinding white.
They only understood that the adults believed preparation was necessary. Civil defense pamphlets arrived in mailboxes. They offered diagrams for building backyard fallout shelters, complete with canned food storage and battery-powered radios. Some families dug into their yards, lining small underground rooms with concrete blocks. Others stacked supplies in basements, just in case. In neighborhoods outside Chicago, children played tag above ground, while below them, sacks of rice and bottled water gathered dust. The coexistence of innocence and preparation defined the era. At kitchen tables, conversations shifted in tone. Parents who had once discussed mortgage rates and school fundraisers now debated ideological threats. What exactly was communism? How did it differ from American democracy? Was it spreading? Could it reach their town? The answers were often simplified. Communism became a shadowy force, godless, authoritarian, foreign. Democracy was framed as virtuous, free, righteous. The complexity of global politics compressed into moral binaries digestible over dinner. Church sermons reinforced these contrasts. Pastors in towns across Dallas and Atlanta spoke of spiritual vigilance. Faith and patriotism intertwined. "In God we trust" was added to currency in 1956, and the phrase "under God" entered the Pledge of Allegiance in 1954, subtle linguistic markers of ideological distinction. Yet fear was not always loud. Often it was quiet and persistent. It lingered in the way fathers paused while reading headlines about the Soviet Union's successful atomic test in 1949. It deepened when the Korean War erupted in 1950, reminding Americans that cold conflicts could still produce hot battlefields. Sons who had barely returned from World War II found themselves eligible for another draft. The concept of mutually assured destruction entered public discourse slowly. The hydrogen bomb tests conducted by both the United States and the Soviet Union suggested a future in which war would not be measured in casualties, but in extinction. The mushroom cloud became a symbol of both power and fragility. In suburban living rooms, families tried to reconcile this knowledge with everyday life. Mothers folded laundry while listening to reports about arms races. Fathers adjusted antennas to improve reception during televised addresses. The ordinary persisted, but it was tinged with awareness. In 1957, when the Soviet Union launched Sputnik, the first artificial satellite, the shock rippled through American households. Radios announced the news with urgency. The idea that a Soviet object orbited overhead unsettled many. If a satellite could circle the Earth, so could a missile. In homes across Los Angeles and Cleveland, parents discussed science education. Schools emphasized mathematics and engineering. The space race became both competition and reassurance, a way to channel anxiety into innovation. Children gazed at the night sky differently after Sputnik. Stars no longer felt distant and eternal. They felt strategic. Televised hearings entered the living room. Senator Mark Carthy's accusations of communist infiltration transformed suspicion into spectacle. Families watched as careers were questioned and reputations dismantled. The fear of subversion extended beyond foreign borders into government offices, universities, even Hollywood. Whispers replaced open debate in some circles. Neighbors hesitated before expressing political opinions. Loyalty oaths were required in certain professions. The boundary between vigilance and paranoia blurred. Children sensed tension without understanding its origins. They noticed when parents lowered their voices at certain topics. They observed when newspapers were folded abruptly. The Cold War was as much emotional as strategic. Meanwhile, popular culture reflected and amplified these anxieties. Science fiction films depicted alien invasions that doubled as metaphors for ideological infiltration. Comic books featured heroes defending freedom against shadowy enemies. The threat was abstract, but omnipresent. In cities like San Francisco, intellectual communities debated nuclear ethics and civil liberties. In smaller towns, discussions remained simpler: trust America, fear communism, prepare for the worst. The Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962 brought tension to a fever pitch. President John F. Kennedy addressed the nation with grave clarity. For 13 days, American households waited. The possibility of nuclear war felt immediate. In living rooms, families sat closer together than usual. Radios remained on longer. Televisions glowed late into the night. Some parents quietly reviewed evacuation plans. Others chose not to speak of fear at all. Children noticed the change in tone, the stillness that settled over dinner conversations. When the crisis passed without catastrophe, relief swept through neighborhoods like a warm breeze. But the knowledge remained. Annihilation had come within reach. The Cold War did not end after that moment. It simply resumed its quieter form. Throughout the 1960s and 1970s, the arms race continued. Missile silos dotted landscapes in the Midwest. Submarines patrolled unseen beneath oceans. Yet, in American homes, the focus often returned to daily routines. The extraordinary threat coexisted with ordinary chores. Television played a central role in shaping perception. News anchors such as Walter Cronkite delivered updates with composed authority, reinforcing trust in institutions. The screen mediated fear, translating geopolitical complexity into digestible narratives. Children practiced drills in schools, then rode bicycles home beneath cloudless skies. Fathers discussed defense spending, then mowed lawns. Mothers clipped coupons while contemplating headlines about détente. The Cold War's psychological impact was cumulative. It did not rely on constant crisis, but on sustained vigilance. A low hum of awareness underlay decades of domestic life. In the 1980s, rhetoric intensified again. President Ronald Reagan referred to the Soviet Union as an evil empire. Strategic Defense Initiative proposals introduced visions of space-based missile shields. Television news replayed images of military parades in Moscow and summits in Geneva. Teenagers who had grown up with duck and cover drills now protested nuclear proliferation. College campuses hosted debates about arms reduction. The living room once again became a site of ideological exchange, with generational differences emerging clearly. And yet, through all these decades, the American home remained standing. Dinner was served, home.
Before the highways were poured in concrete and stitched across the continent in long gray ribbons, America moved differently. It moved by rail schedules and river currents. It moved through two-lane roads that curved through town centers, past courthouse squares and white-steepled churches. Travel was slower, more intimate. You passed through places rather than around them. You noticed storefronts. You stopped at traffic lights that blinked yellow after midnight. The country felt vast, but also segmented, stitched together loosely by routes that had grown organically rather than by design. Then came the vision of connection on a new scale. In 1956, under President Dwight D. Eisenhower, Congress passed the Federal Aid Highway Act of 1956. It authorized the construction of what would become the interstate highway system, over 40,000 miles of controlled access roads designed to link cities, states, and coasts with unprecedented efficiency. The reasoning was practical. The memory of wartime logistics lingered. Efficient transport had proven essential during World War II. There were also strategic concerns: rapid evacuation routes in case of nuclear attack, swift military mobilization if needed. But to ordinary Americans, the interstate did not first appear as a military precaution. It appeared as possibility. Bulldozers arrived at the edges of towns in Kansas and Pennsylvania. Surveyors marked fields with small flags.
Concrete was poured in long, deliberate stretches. Overpasses rose like modern monuments. The landscape itself began to shift, subtly and then dramatically. Farmers watched as new roads cut through property lines that had been stable for generations. Some sold land willingly, recognizing opportunity. Others mourned the quiet disappearance of open space. The transformation was both economic and emotional. When the first sections opened, drivers experienced something unfamiliar: uninterrupted movement. No stoplights, no sharp turns into town squares, no need to slow for pedestrians crossing from bakery to post office. Cars entered on ramps, accelerated, and merged into steady streams of traffic moving in the same direction at the same speed. It felt modern, it felt efficient, it felt like progress. Families in suburbs outside Chicago and Los Angeles began using these roads not just for commuting, but for exploration. Someday drives extended farther. Weekend trips no longer required complex planning. The road itself became an invitation. Automobiles had already become symbols of independence, but the interstate magnified their significance. A car was no longer simply a vehicle for errands, it was a passport. On summer mornings, station wagons were packed with suitcases, coolers, and restless children. Mothers handed out sandwiches wrapped in wax paper. Fathers unfolded maps across steering wheels before engines turned over. The promise of distant beaches, mountain cabins, or national parks shimmered ahead. Motels emerged along exits like punctuation marks on the highway's long sentences. Neon signs advertised vacancy. Rooms were modest: 2 beds, a small TV, an ice machine humming outside, but they offered something revolutionary: standardized comfort for travelers far from home. Chains began to form, ensuring predictable accommodations whether you were in St. Louis or Phoenix. The unfamiliar felt manageable because the room layout remained the same. Travel lost some of its unpredictability, replaced by reliability. Roadside diners flourished as well. Chrome exteriors gleamed beneath the sun. Inside, vinyl booths lined walls, and waitresses refilled coffee cups with practiced efficiency. Men in short-sleeved shirts and families with sunburned noses ordered burgers and milkshakes as jukeboxes hummed quietly in corners. These diners became cultural crossroads. Long-haul truckers sat beside vacationing families. Conversations drifted across topics: gas prices, baseball scores, distant cities. The interstate did not only move vehicles, it moved stories. Small towns experienced change in quieter ways. Before the highway, U.S. routes carried travelers directly through main streets. Gas stations, motels, and cafes thrived on passing traffic. When the highway diverted cars around town instead of through it, some businesses faded. Windows that once displayed postcards and homemade pies began to gather dust. In places across Missouri and Oklahoma, bypassed towns felt a subtle loss. The road that had once defined them now ignored them. Yet for others, the highway offered opportunity. Suburbs expanded rapidly because commuting became easier. Workers could live farther from urban centers and still arrive at offices on time. Residential developments spread along exit corridors. Shopping centers followed. Migration patterns shifted. Young adults from rural communities traveled more frequently to cities, sometimes for college, sometimes for work, and sometimes simply because they could. The psychological distance between regions shrank. A cross-country drive that once seemed daunting became an attainable adventure. College students piled into cars and followed routes toward New York City or San Francisco, chasing careers or countercultural movements. Musicians toured more efficiently. Bands could move equipment from state to state without navigating labyrinthine local roads. The sound of rock and roll traveled alongside asphalt. The interstate also reshaped commerce. Distribution networks accelerated. Goods moved faster from factories to storefronts. Supermarkets stocked produce from distant states. Regional specialties became national staples. Most drivers did not consider the broader implications. They only noticed convenience. They appreciated shaving hours off travel time. They enjoyed the smoothness of pavement compared to cracked rural routes. Infrastructure worked best when it was invisible. On Friday evenings, the headlights of cars merged into steady streams leaving cities. Workers escaping office towers in Houston or Detroit drove toward lakeside cabins or relatives' homes. Traffic jams became new rituals, shared inconvenience in exchange for mobility. Radio stations adapted to this mobile audience. Car radios broadcast traffic reports and weather forecasts tailored for drivers. Songs became soundtracks for highways, ballads about freedom, escape, longing. The open road entered American mythology as symbol and stage. Films and literature reflected this shift. Stories of cross-country journeys captured imaginations. The idea that one could start in Maine and end in California without leaving a continuous ribbon of pavement felt almost miraculous. But beneath this romance lay structural consequences. Urban highways often cut directly through established neighborhoods, particularly in minority communities. Construction displaced families. Brick homes were demolished to make room for overpasses. Noise and pollution followed. Progress came at uneven cost. In New Orleans and Miami, elevated interstates divided districts that had once thrived on local interaction. Residents adjusted, but the landscape had been permanently altered. Meanwhile, motels multiplied along highways, standardizing travel experience. Roadside architecture grew less distinctive as corporate branding replaced local signage. The quirky roadside attractions, giant statues, hand-painted billboards, gradually competed with uniform franchises. Families still embarked on summer road trips, but the experience shifted subtly from discovery to efficiency. Routes were planned for speed rather than scenic detours. Travel became less about wandering and more about arriving. Yet the road retained its emotional pull. Teenagers earned driver's licenses and felt a surge of independence unlike any previous generation. The car, combined with the interstate, meant mobility without parental supervision. Dates began with engine ignition. Conversations unfolded beneath dashboard lights. Truck drivers forged new occupational cultures, spending days or weeks on the road. Rest stops became communal spaces where strangers shared coffee and fatigue. CB radios carried conversations across miles of asphalt. The interstate also influenced suburban growth. Housing developments clustered near exits. Shopping centers rose where cornfields once stood. The ability to travel quickly encouraged spatial sprawl. Cities spread outward rather than upward. Few paused to consider that infrastructure was shaping behavior. Commuting patterns defined daily routines. Families adjusted dinner times around traffic. Employers located offices near highway access. Political campaigns targeted suburban districts created by road expansion. The open road symbolized freedom, but it also structured dependence on.
The movement did not begin with a speech heard around the world. It began with smaller sounds. It began with folding chairs scraping across church floors, with hymnals opening in unison, with neighbors lowering their voices on front porches after sunset. It began with conversations that felt risky even when spoken softly. In the mid-1950s, in cities like Montgomery, daily life followed rigid lines drawn long before most residents were born. There were separate entrances, separate water fountains, separate seating sections on buses. The system was so woven into ordinary routines that challenging it felt less like activism and more like disruption of gravity itself.
But disruption often starts with stillness. When Rosa Parks refused to surrender her seat on a Montgomery bus in 1955, the act was quiet. There was no raised voice, no dramatic gesture, just a refusal to stand. The power of that moment lay not in spectacle, but in steadiness. Word traveled through church networks first. Ministers telephoned one another. Minographed leaflets were distributed by hand. Carpools were organized before sunrise. The Montgomery bus boycott did not rely on headlines. It relied on discipline. Day after day, week after week, Black residents walked to work rather than ride segregated buses. The sidewalks became testimony. Shoes wore thin. Heels struck pavement in rhythm. Employers noticed punctual employees arriving on foot. White residents noticed empty bus seats. What appeared from a distance to be inconvenience was from within an assertion of dignity. At Dexter Avenue Baptist Church, a young minister named Martin Luther King Jr. emerged as a voice capable of carrying both conviction and restraint. His speeches were firm, but grounded in nonviolence. He spoke not of revenge, but of justice. His words echoed through sanctuaries before they reached national audiences. But before there were mass marches, there were kitchen table debates. Families gathered after church services to discuss strategy. Could they afford to keep walking? Would retaliation escalate? Parents worried about safety. Teenagers expressed impatience. Change moved at the pace of courage, and courage moved unevenly. In Greensboro, North Carolina, in 1960, 4 black college students sat down at a segregated lunch counter and politely requested service. They were denied. They remained seated. The sit-in was not dramatic. There were no raised fists, just young men sitting quietly, waiting. Their stillness unsettled the room. The act spread. Within days, students in cities across the South replicated the gesture. In Nashville and Atlanta, young people filled lunch counters, libraries, and bus stations. They dressed neatly, pressed shirts, ties, dresses, projecting respectability against hostility. Training sessions preceded many of these actions. In church basements, volunteers rehearsed how to remain calm when insulted. They practiced absorbing verbal abuse without retaliation. Nonviolence required preparation. It demanded emotional discipline as much as moral conviction. Television cameras eventually arrived, but before they did, communities had already shifted internally. White business owners faced decisions they had long avoided. Local officials confronted ordinances that no longer felt stable. Conversations between neighbors grew tense, then necessary. The civil rights movement was often framed as confrontation, but it was also persuasion. In small towns across Mississippi and Alabama, ministers preached sermons that carefully threaded scripture with social commentary. They spoke of exodus, of liberation, of moral obligation. Congregations responded not only with amens, but with organized plans. Mass meetings became ritual. After long workdays, residents gathered to hear updates and renew commitment. The sound of gospel singing filled sanctuaries, not as performance, but as sustenance. Music steadied nerves. It turned fear into fellowship. Meanwhile, opposition hardened. In Birmingham, Police Commissioner Bull Connor ordered the use of fire hoses and police dogs against demonstrators. Images captured by photographers revealed children pressed against brick walls by torrents of water. The brutality shocked national audiences. But within Birmingham's black neighborhoods, the buildup had been gradual. Meetings, leaflets, prayers, each act layered upon the previous one, until resistance became collective rather than individual. The March on Washington in 1963 is often remembered for its soaring rhetoric,
especially King's "I Have a Dream" speech. Yet that moment, held near the Lincoln Memorial, was the crest of years of groundwork. Organizers negotiated logistics quietly: permits, transportation, food. Volunteers coordinated buses from cities like Detroit and Chicago. Participants did not arrive spontaneously, they prepared. Churches raised funds for travel. Families debated whether it was safe to attend. The march was both symbolic and practical, proof that community networks could mobilize peacefully at scale. Legislation followed activism, but not instantly. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965 emerged from sustained pressure. Lawmakers debated provisions in committee rooms far from the streets, yet those debates were fueled by the persistence of ordinary citizens who refused to accept gradualism as sufficient. In Selma, Alabama, marchers crossing the Edmund Pettus Bridge were met with violence. Bloody Sunday entered national vocabulary. But before that day, Selma's black residents had endured years of restricted voting access. They attended workshops on literacy tests. They stood in lines at registrars' offices, only to be turned away. The movement was as much about paperwork as protest. Local organizers, often less famous than national leaders, carried much of the burden. Teachers, barbers, domestic workers, and farmers opened their homes for meetings. They stored pamphlets in closets. They drove neighbors to registration sites. Their names rarely appeared in headlines, yet their labor sustained momentum. White allies also engaged in conversations that altered communities from within. Some clergy members in predominantly white congregations began addressing segregation openly. Not all parishioners agreed. Tension surfaced in pews once united by silence. In northern cities like New York City and Chicago, segregation was less codified by law, but present in housing and employment practices. Activists organized around school integration and redlining. The struggle extended beyond southern bus stations into urban neighborhoods shaped by policy. Media coverage amplified certain moments, but lived experience transformed others more slowly. A white store owner deciding to serve all customers equally, a black voter casting a ballot for the first time, a school board revising enrollment zones. Each change began with conversation. Some were heated, others hesitant. Parents debated at PTA meetings. City council members fielded public comments. Business associations weighed profit against principle. No single dialogue resolved centuries of injustice, but accumulation mattered. The movement was not monolithic. It contained differing philosophies: nonviolent resistance, black nationalism, grassroots community organizing. Figures like Malcolm X articulated sharper critiques of systemic racism. His speeches resonated particularly in urban centers where frustration simmered. Within households, generational differences emerged. Older activists emphasized patience, younger ones demanded urgency. Siblings disagreed across dinner tables. Change rarely moved at a uniform pace. Violence, when it occurred, left deep scars. The assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. in 1968 reverberated through cities nationwide. Grief mingled with anger. In many neighborhoods, fires lit up night skies. Yet even in mourning, community leaders urged reflection and rebuilding. What endured beyond tragedy was infrastructure of another kind, networks of trust. Churches had learned to mobilize quickly. Students had learned to coordinate. Lawyers had learned to challenge discriminatory laws effectively. The civil rights movement built institutional memory that would inform later struggles for gender equality, disability rights, and LGBTQ+ rights. But its earliest victories were quieter. They were seen when a black family moved into a previously all-white neighborhood and, after initial hostility, found cautious acceptance. They were felt
when a young black student entered an integrated classroom and discovered at least one